Okay. So 4 more minutes and we'll begin. We have 51 people waiting. I think it's a great number. A great number. I used to organize webinar and sometimes I have 5, 6, 10. Yes, my students join our webinars if I offer something in change, one extra point or something like that. If not, they prefer not to join the webinar. So I don't know if that's the same in your countries, but there's something in change always. Of course, I will cut this in the recording. Yes. I will edit the video so we can say everything as we want.
There are, Joe, there are 54 people are waiting for. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Can see
So
that? Yeah.
if you want, we can start right now. Okay?
Okay, okay.
Okay, great. So I will let everyone in.
Yes. So it's there are more than 100 people. Yeah, it's a very large meeting actually.
Yeah, of
For the
course.
webinars. Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, so let me wait until everyone is inside. Mhm. Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from different time zones. My name is José Joel Peña Llanes, Associate Professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And together with my colleague and friend Xuxi from Jinan University, I have the pleasure of serving as co-organizer and moderator of our webinar series, Rethinking Mexico-China U.S. Relation in Disrupted Global Order, a Multidisciplinary Perspective. Thank you very much for being here for our first session titled Mexico-China Relations at the End of Certainty, the Crisis of Liberal International Order and its Global Repercussions. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge and thank our lead organizers, the FES Acatlán of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where I teach, and Jinan University, Faculty of Law, where my colleague and friend Shishu is an associate professor, as well as our co-organizing institutions connected to today's speakers, the National Autonomous Universities of Mexico's Faculty of Political and Social Science, Tokyo International University, the Global Governance Institute of Brussels, and Xi'an Jiantong University. We are very grateful for your support in bringing this conversation to a wide, truly international audience. Now, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Xuxi for a brief introduction.
Okay.
The floor is
Yes.
yours.
Thank you very much, Joe, for all of the introduction and organization for these webinars. Your Excellencies, dear distinguished guests, speakers, and audience online. And it's my great honor to see some words before our webinars. So it's my great honor to address this seminar on the examining the Mexico, China, United States trilateral relations on behalf of Jinan University Law School. And as an institution dedicated to the international legal order and cross-cultural exchanges, we deeply recognize the profound significance of this trilateral dynamic in international trade, uh, world order, and also other many hot issues of the world. So the relationship between China and Mexico, and also China, United States, and also United States and Mexico are very important in our international relations. And also in this, as our theme of this conference or the webinars say, this is in a disputed world order. So there are dynamics of three countries in the world will be very important to the world development and also the security. So today, our guests are also the ambassador and also other scholars in the different universities. They are all experts in China, United States, Mexico relations. So I hope these webinars, these three series of webinars will give us a door and also a window to know the dynamics of three countries, and also to how to re-examine the international peace and security, and to also reflect on the international law, international relation, and also the world development. So it's my great honor to welcome all of you to join these webinars. So on behalf of Jinan University Law School, we will continue to work on these very important issues and also provide our contributions to the academia and also the real operation of the international politics. So thank you very much, Joe. This is just my brief welcoming remarks and also introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Xi, for these kind words. In this opening webinar, we will analyze the erosion of multilateralism, the rise of nationalist and protectionist policies, and the geopolitical consequences of the United States unilateral turn under President Trump's leadership, focusing on how these dynamics shape the global environment in which Mexico-China relations unfold. Our goal is to connect the big picture, rules, norms, and power shifts to concrete implications for policymakers, firms, and universities across our regions. Regarding the format of the webinar, each speaker will have 15 minutes for their presentation, and then we'll move to question and answers. Please use the question and answer box or the chat to submit concise questions at any point. Include your name and affiliation and indicate if your question is directed to a specific speaker or to all of them. We'll prioritize questions that advance the comparative and policy dimensions of today's topic. Now, let me introduce our speakers in today's order. First of all, Ambassador Jose Luis Bernal. Ambassador Bernal retired from the Mexican Foreign Service in 2022 after 42 years of service. He served as ambassador of Mexico to China, to South Korea, Mongolia, and the Democratic Popular Republic of Korea, to the Czech Republic, and to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. He was also Consul General in Los Angeles in the United States, Deputy Representative to the OECD, and Mexico's senior official in APEC, with earlier positions in Washington, D.C. He holds a bachelor in international relations from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a master degrees in economic from the CIDE. He has taught in Mexico, the United States, and Europe, and is currently a senior fellow at the COMEXI. His work focuses on geopolitics, economic diplomacy, and North American and Asia relations. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being here. Dr. Mariana Escalante is a full-time professor at the Center for International Relations of the Faculty of Political and Social Science of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She holds a PhD in Political and Social Science from the UNAM and a Master's in International Relations from Beijing University in the Chinese language program. So she speaks Chinese very fluently. She completed research stays in China at UNAM's China-Mexico Studies Center initiatives and at Beijing University, and has taught widely at the undergraduate level in Mexico. A former translator and editor at Xianhua's Latin American Regional Office, she is a member of Mexico's National System of Researchers and the Eurasia Studies Group. Her recent publications include Nationalism and Confucianism in Contemporary China and co-editing Half a Century of Mexico-China Diplomatic Relations. Thank you very much, Dr. Escalante, for being here. Also, I would like to introduce Dr. Christopher Lamont. He is Professor of International Relations and Vice Dean of the Graduate School of International Relations at Tokyo International University and Deputy Head of Program for AI Governance at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. His research sits at the intersection of global governance, technology, and global justice. He co-hosts the Age of AI podcast, holds a PhD in politics from the University of Glasgow and a master's science in international and European politics from the University of Edinburgh, and also a bachelor in international studies from the University of Mississippi. And he has been both a Fulbright Fellow and an RCUK postdoctoral fellow. Thank you very much, Dr. Lamont. And finally, but not the least, Dr. Kuo Jianping. She is Associate Professor of Law at Xianyang University. Her research concentrates on marine environmental protection, international dispute settlements, and climate change law. She has published in both English and Chinese and is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Hamburg. Thank you very much, Professor Kuo, especially because you are in Germany and the schedule is no so good for you, but thank you very much for being here. Thank you all or our great speakers. And with that, let's begin. So, Ambassador Bernal, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes from now.
Thank you. Good evening to all the participants in Mexico and Europe. Good morning for our friends in China. Let me share my presentation here. Can you see it? I'm very pleased to be part of this very select group of experts taking part in this seminar. A seminar that is put together by prestigious academic institutions, both in China and in Mexico. And I would like to express my special appreciation to Dr. Jose Joel Peña and Professor Xu for their excellent work in organizing this series of webinars. Today, I will speak about the scenarios the relationship between Mexico and China may face in the near future, given the profound changes taking place in the global arena. I think this is the objective of this series, and I'm very glad to contribute a little bit about the understanding of the new trends. For this, I will briefly review how we got here, the current status of affairs, and the possibilities ahead of us. First, the historical context of the bilateral relations. The bilateral, I mean, it is a fact, and we know about this. I will go very briefly that the bilateral relationship between Mexico and China has evolved since 1949 in line with the level of development of the two countries, in line also with the respective participation in global affairs, and the political willingness. The political willingness is a very important factor to develop closer ties in cooperation. Broadly speaking, it is possible to identify different chapters in the evolution of this relationship. From 1949 to 1971, there was a lack of knowledge of each other, which was understandable, given the lack of communication, the geographic distance, and the two countries concentrating their efforts in domestic matters. In 1972, the rest of the world began to dedicate increasing attention to the People's Republic of China. This was the year when Mexico decided to establish diplomatic relations with China and stop recognizing Taiwan, even if that meant going against the United States position at that time. From 1972 to the end of the 1990s, most of the contacts between the two countries were held in the context of multilateral organizations. with only sporadic bilateral contacts in a period that we may characterize as a competition between the two emerging economies. This competition, this situation of competition lasted mainly or until Mexico was the last country in accepting China's joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. It is important to note that since 1997, China and Mexico entered a period of constant improvement of their bilateral relations. The first association was established as a global association in 1997, and the idea was to pay special attention to political dialogue, official visits, to build a robust juridical framework, to develop stronger economic exchanges, mainly on trade and investment, to promote social contacts, and there was a big impetus on tourism, cultural and educational exchanges, as well as on technical and technological cooperation. Given these developments, in 2003, a comprehensive association was established, which was upgraded very soon to the level of a strategic comprehensive association, only 10 years later, during President Xi Jinping's visit to Mexico in 2013. The new framework was included, the new framework included the establishment of innovative mechanisms for dialogue, mainly the high-level groups on economic matters dealing with trade and investment, on finance, and a high-level group which is unique to this relationship of business leaders of the two countries. Also, the two governments decided to strengthen the bilateral group already existing on multilateral affairs, and all this together, this reinforced institutional framework and the conferred political willingness. I insist always on this, the importance of the political dialogue, provided the basis for the continued growth of relations in the sector, from trade to investment, technology, people-to-people exchanges, cooperation for development. And it's important to notice that this relationship was or has been increasing not only with the participation of national authorities, government-to-government relations, but with the increasing participation of actors coming from other sectors, including subnational authorities, interparliamentary meetings, and increasing participation of actors coming mostly from educational institutions, think tanks, and research centers. I can say, because this coincides with the time I was serving in Beijing, and I say with the benefit of hindsight, that the peak of this was reached during the times of the COVID-19 pandemic, when China and Mexico demonstrated the many possibilities of joint action in dealing with the emergency by developing many deep cooperation programs. Now, the result of these mechanisms of dialogue and cooperation led for China to become very rapidly the second most important trade partner of Mexico, second only to the United States. The bilateral trade has been expanding every year and has been above the $100 billion mark every year since 2019. Last year, bilateral trade reached $130 billion, including the purchase by Mexico of Chinese products in the order of $119 billion. Of course, this representing a huge deficit for Mexico. Investment by Chinese companies has also been on the rise, and only during the first half of this year, Chinese investments increased by 20%. With that, more than 1,500 new ventures have been established in Mexico in the last 6 years, most of them attracted by the ongoing relocation or nearshoring trends. And it's important to mention this because this is creating very important production chains, linking our two countries, in many cases also with the participation of other countries, mainly the United States. Now, these relations have not happened in the vacuum. The international context has always been a determining factor of bilateral contacts. Traditionally, Mexico, we know, has put into practice an independent foreign policy. However, the margins of maneuver have been limited in various topics and different moments due to the close interdependence Mexico has with the United States. And I have to say that this influence by the United States has never been more determinant than today, given the deep interdependence between Mexico and the United States and the changing conditions of international competition, which is characterized mainly by the systemic confrontation between the United States and China. And this takes me to say a few words about the changing global scenario of today's. The disruptive measures implemented by President Donald Trump since early this year, we know are transforming radically the world order that was created since the end of World War II, a structure that was considered more or less stable and that most countries trusted until recently. The protectionist policies implemented by the United States have upset what was considered as normal in the economy, in the functioning of the global supply chains, in diplomacy, even in the very direction of political systems. And we must understand these changes, and the root causes just to address the new challenges effectively. For that, we need to answer a few questions, such as the following. What explains the radical change of policies on the part of the United States? Is it only a cyclical change in terms of trade, and we will return to normality once the issue of the deficit is solved, or whenever there is a change in leadership? Or are we rather facing a redefinition of long-term strategies in the United States, determined especially by its loss of competitiveness and the competition with China? I think this is a challenge for academic institutions, for researchers, and of course for decision makers. But the point I would like to make today is that at the background of the changes we are experiencing is the systemic competition between the United States and China, a competition in which the dominant power and the ascendant power are sort of competing, not fighting, but competing each other for geopolitical supremacy, and it has economic, political, and other manifestations in multiple sectors and dimensions. In this competition, this systemic competition, the so-called trade war is only the tip of the iceberg. At the bottom, we can see technological and industrial competition, the placement of investments, financial and monetary issues, military and national security interests, with each of the powers defending the respective political and ideological projects. And all this is reflected in the search for greater influence in sectors, regions, and international organizations, in the creation of new economic, political, and military alliances, even in the redefinition or recreation of multilateral organizations. In the new normal, practically all countries are being forced to review their growth strategies and realign their economic and trade policies in face of the new economic environments. And we can say that in the near future, there is no doubt that we will continue to see the securitization of economic relations and enter into a new period of uncertainty with calls for decoupling, the risking in the relation with China coming mainly from the United States. Now, this background sets the spotlight on the possible scenarios for the near future of relations between Mexico and China. I would like to mention 4 possible scenarios. There are more, but some of them are quite catastrophic, I can say. The first one we'll consider a normal path of progress in the different sectors of the bilateral relationship. This scenario of continuity would lead, of course, to more political dialogue, the updating of institutional mechanisms of the bilateral relationship, or Mexico implementing a policy of export expansion, exploring new formulas of cooperation for development, increasing social contacts, expanding consultation between the two countries on global issues. I mean, this could mean continuing with the trends we have seen in the last, at least in the last 3 decades. And we can say that this scenario is highly desirable. However, the changing conditions do not allow us to be optimistic about this. Now, alternative scenarios present us with two possibilities of joint economic strategy towards China, joint between Mexico and the United States, or Mexico, United States, Canada. One variant is, I would say, is a little bit negative. It considers the potential for distancing and fiercer competition. The other one contemplates joint actions to promote, including China, to promote potential alliances in competitiveness and cooperation. The first one, I mean, scenario 2.8, considers that the United States, Canada, and Mexico could decide to join forces to counteract China in North America. We must remember that in the transit to a new world order, trade deficits and technological dependence are subject to special scrutiny. And these topics will be certainly on the negotiating table in the forthcoming review of the USMCA. Indeed, the China factor will be on the table, although China will not be part of the talk. In addition to that, we may expect the continued politicization of economic matters as new requirements are imposed to Mexico on border issues, migration, drug trafficking, and other issues. The next scenario, 2B, calls for trilateral communication and cooperation involving the North American countries and China. In recognition of the many exchanges that have trilateral or multi-party content, which add to the numerous investments and interconnections in technology, finance, and other areas, both in North America and in China. The fact is, and we must recognize this, there is a deep interdependence between the three economies, three, including United States, Canada, Mexico, plus China, four economies, that must be understood and encouraged to keep growing. The question is, how could we promote a trilateral communication that allow us to ensure the benefits that the three parties obtain from their existing linkages, and what kind of actions could be implemented in order for this to continue prospering in a positive way? There is another scenario that is more related to Mexico only, and this scenario considers that in case that the USMCA review doesn't bring a favorable outcome, Mexico could decide to pursue a different model of development, a model less dependent, and could put into practice a new sort of non-alignment in foreign policy. It's something similar to what other Latin American countries are doing nowadays. Let me conclude by saying that the main challenge we face in Mexico today is how we preserve our competitive advantages. These advantages are largely dependent on our association with the United States and Canada. And we have to recognize that at the same time, this is also increasingly linked to the participation of Chinese products, technologies, investments in the Mexican economy, as well as in the other two countries in North America. And this poses a big dilemma for policymakers. In facing this dilemma, we need to find the way to convince decision makers of the virtues of continued developing production chains that benefit all participants at the end. This is a delicate balance that is challenged and will be increasingly more subject to pressure from the United States. But we need to understand the new trends in international relations, understand the root causes, pay attention to the emerging challenges, and be ready to grab opportunities of mutual benefit in the long run in a sort of win-win-win model. For that, and this is my final comment, we need to become more creative and work together with our friends in China, in the United States, in Canada, of course, in order to make the new era a positive, constructive era, not otherwise. Thank you for your attention, and I will be ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Building on Ambassador's Jose Luis Bernal Rodriguez framing of Mexico-China ties in a new global era, let's move to a global south lens that reimagines development beyond the liberal order. Dr. Mariana Escalante, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes, and a quick reminder to our audience, please submit your questions in the chat anytime.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Okay, perfect. Well, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, Professor Joel Peña and Professor Xu. It's a pleasure. And it's also a pleasure to speak in this panel with distinguished colleagues and also with Ambassador Bernal. I feel very honored. My talk is titled Rethinking Development Beyond the Liberal Order, Mexico and China, Voices from the Global South. Well, the central argument I want to explore is that we are witnessing not primarily just a geopolitical competition, but a normative one, and this is over ideas, values, and principles. The liberal order built on democracy, individualism, markets is decaying in many eyes, and alternative principles like collective well-being, sovereignty, development on different terms is emerging and is growing in strength. And in this scenario, Mexico and China are two voices from the global south that expose the limits of the US-led liberal order and are trying to propose alternatives, even if imperfectly. Let's begin with what's failing in the liberal order. The idea that liberal democracy, individualism, and the free market model are universal prescriptions is increasingly questioned internally, and I take, of course, the example of the US. The US and many democracies are having some erosion of the democratic trust. There is polarization, inequality. We have been witnessing, of course, some very important and very problematic global shocks from pandemics, from wars, supply chain disruptions, climate change, a lot of problems that expose how fragile the liberal model can be. And in this case, the US has played a normative role. The US is demanding alignment with its values, framing policies as moral imperatives, and using trade, of course, what we have been witnessing in the last few years, in the last few days, using trade and regulatory coercion to make others align. I think about what Peking University professor Wang Qisi says, that liberal order's legitimacy is eroding. The struggle is over whose values will shape the new order, and that's why I'm talking about this normative vision of from the global south and to the global south. So how the liberal order has hindered Mexico's development, and what does this mean? Mexico's economy is deeply tied to the US. Approximately 80 to 84% of its non-oil exports go to the US. This gives, of course, a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of vulnerabilities. Many export industries in Mexico rely heavily on these exports, and well, growth projections are very modest for Mexico this year. In 2025, around 1% is the expected growth this year. Maybe with a slight improvement in 2026, if external conditions are favorable, but our growth is very close and dependent on the global trends. And well, in recent years, of course, we have seen also a very interesting phenomenon. US has pressed Mexico to reduce dependence on Chinese technology. And well, this pressure has also seen that Mexico is exporting more advanced technology to the US. The gap is being reduced, and recently, just in August, Mexico is the first advanced tech exporter to the US, no, which is a very interesting phenomenon. I'm not gonna go deep into this data, but I think it's something interest. But also this pressure that I'm talking about from the US is the US is asking Mexico not only to change its suppliers, but to align with US ideas of risk, security standards, which I think is the most problematic aspect. So let's look at how Mexico and China have been working. Ambassador Bernal, of course, because of his expertise, his experience, gave us a very important outlook of how the bilateral relations are. I'm not going to talk about them, but I think I want to show how even with small margin, both countries have managed to get closer. Trade with China has grown significantly. I also have like this data, 130 billion in recent years has been the bilateral trade between China and Mexico. We have a very strong bilateral framework. Sometimes we don't really get advantage of this very strong bilateral framework in many areas, in agricultural science, tech transfer, clean energy, etc. No, not just like the common and traditional exchange. And Mexico also has this advantage of nearshoring, but also because of the situation of the USMCA right now, we have this uncertainty, of course. And for Mexico, the relationship with China, it gives an opportunity to have trade diversification, of course. We haven't really taken advantage of this particular opportunity in a very broad way. But also, Mexico has enjoined some very important initiatives from China, like the Belt and Road Initiative, and it has been taken a very cautious approach to with Chinese with the Chinese, no. And on the other side, and talking, going back to these normative, alternative, and narratives. Well, we can see what China is doing and why its model is attractive. No, it could be attractive to anyone, especially particularly to Mexico. The alternatives that China is promoting is based on many pillars, but I'm mentioning 6: sovereignty, non-interference, the idea of shared future for humankind, equality, multilateralism, and the rule of law. I put to number 5 in my, sorry, there was a mistake. And so this shows another, let's say, another view of how international relations can be seen, no? And we can see this difference from what the US is proposing. And also, there are some very important initiatives. Some of them has been existing for a while, like the Belt and Road Initiative, of course. I'm not going to describe them all, just to mention them. The Global Governance Initiative, which was launched in 2021. Sorry, the Global Governance Initiative was just launched recently in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and focuses on reforming global governance, institutions, etc. Also, the global development, the global security, and the global civilization initiatives have these alternative visions of a normative framework, one not driven by liberal universalism, but also by pluralism, mutual benefit, and sovereignty. And I think this could be attractive, of course, for the Chinese, for Mexico. So another topic which is being linked with what I've been saying is that seeing the recent developments that show in the past few days, Mexico sits in a tension zone, a normative battle between these contesting powers, which are the US and China. And Mexico is often pressured by the US to adopt some ideas, some values, and some actions, of course. No, we can see, of course, the most recent was at the US-Mexico Semiconductor Forum. From the US, it was asserted, and I will quote, "We will not tolerate dependence on key technologies from China. Mexico must play a key role." And this is, of course, not only a suggestion, I think it's a normative pressure, not just about trade, but about values, alignment, and dependency that the US wants Mexico to be aligned to. Of course, we have seen other measures like the 50% tariffs on Chinese imports that will affect, not just cars, but a lot of Chinese imports. And this is still to be confirmed, but it was a very important measure, of course. And also, China, what is China doing against it? The trade investigation, and of course, US pressures. And I also wanted to quote this reply from the Chinese embassy in Mexico that said, the United States is not really concerned about Mexico's development, but rather about forcing this country to act as its geopolitical instrument in industrial and supply chains. And also, China called to all the countries in the world that have been affected by the US tariffs to jointly oppose unilateralism and protectionism in any form. So I think even though we're talking about trade and we're talking about economy, this goes far beyond discourse and narratives that, of course, can affect economy. I'm going to go a little bit faster. So what are Mexico's gains and challenges under these different orders? Well, of course, there are some benefits that we have been seeing in the recent years. Of course, Mexico can benefit from more diversified export markets, having less vulnerability and less dependence to the US, greater access to Chinese infrastructure, finance, technology transfer, etc. Mexico could have, of course, a stronger bargaining power. Other factors, but also there are some risks of if Mexico has to pick sides. And I get inspired on what Ambassador Bernal said about these scenarios. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with the USMCA, for example. But if Mexico gets too aligned with China, of course, it may suffer the US reprisals, penalties, loss of preferential treatments, etc. And there are also some concerns from the Chinese parts about technology leak, and knowledge concerns from the Chinese parts, and also from the US part, some domestic political pressures, etc. So, of course, Mexico should do a lot of things, and I won't get into that, but Mexico has to restructure its own institutions to be a more competitive actor, of course. And to what extent is Mexico attracted to the Chinese model? Well, it's very attractive in many aspects, like infrastructure, large investment. Chinese pose fewer political conditions, at least rhetorically, and a narrative supportive of sovereignty and development without external interference. I think that's very important. But also, Mexico is not formally in Chinese main institutions or initiatives, and this is mainly because of of the cost of offending or separating from the North American alignment, no, especially with the US. And well, I'm going to get close to the conclusions. So Mexico and China, as co-actors or as voices of the global South, can jointly articulate critiques of the liberal order's normative dominance. The idea that the US can dictate what is acceptable, what is secure, who counts. I think China and Mexico can play a greater role on this. There are narratives that converge on defending sovereignty, rejecting coercion, proposing models based on mutual benefits, pluralism, etc. No, and just some final remarks. Well, what I intended to say is that the liberal order is not longer an universal horizon. Its legitimacy is under deep challenge. The contest of values is central. It's not just institutional or geopolitical, it's normative. Values, legitimacy, development models are contested. Mexico and China each offer different but overlapping visions. I mean, obviously, China's model is more prominent and more important, but Mexico is already acting not passively, but of course with a very careful approach to how, especially to how to approach with the US. And well, it requires, of course, a lot of domestic reforms in the Mexican aspects. I was going to mention about institutional capacity, infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, human capital, etc. And the cost of staying strictly within the liberal order is rising, no? But fully replacing the US alignment with China is neither feasible nor necessarily desirable, and too many trade, institutional, political, normative costs. So the path is selective alignment, like all these scenarios Ambassador Bernal already proposed to us, and improved agency, institutional strength. And I will just close with the question, will Mexico choose to remain a passive actor or assert its own voice in shaping a new order like China? And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Escalante, for your presentation. And from that South-South perspective, we now turn to the third vertex shaping this triangle, I think, how US policy conditions the regional context. So, Dr. Christopher Lamont, you have 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First to the organizers, Joel Pena and Shushi, for inviting me and having me here at this wonderful panel. I've already learned a lot from the contributions by Ambassador Bernal and Professor Escalante, and I think in a way this presentation dovetails with some of what they have observed. And so my perspective and the background that I have is going to help provide a more bird's eye view approach to looking at US foreign policy towards Latin America more broadly under the second Trump administration. And one of the questions that Ambassador Bernal asked in his presentation was, are we witnessing something as a more fundamental long-term shift in US foreign policy, or is this something that's transient and there will be kind of a return to some of the values-focused foreign policy that we've seen in the past? And I'll try to address some of that in the presentation. But I think one thing that is important to begin with is that we're still relatively early in the second Trump administration. And generally speaking, when you have shifts in US administrations, you have an attempt to put to emphasize difference from the past. And you're certainly seeing that in the case of the second Trump administration. In fact, there's been a significant realignment and reassessment of priorities kind of more broadly. And it's still not entirely clear where the dust will settle on some of these. Although, right, it is clear that there is a shift from kind of a more kind of a human rights, democracy promotion, worldview. And as Professor Escalante mentioned, right, this crumbling confidence in the liberal order is not just something that you observe in the global South, but is also kind of within kind of those countries that used to frame a lot of kind of their diplomacy in the context of core liberal orders values. So kind of a shift from value centered to what is described often as a more transactional approach. And also kind of a shift from democracy, right? You're seeing this not just in Latin America, but in other parts of the world, in other kind of US relationships, and also a shift in terms of how human rights promotion is addressed, right? So you might think about kind of the closing down, as of course, is in the image there of the US Agency for International Development. But not just that, right? There's also the U.S. Institute for Peace, kind of the Wilson Center being kind of reduced to kind of the core kind of structural funding and the such. And then also something that you've observed quite a bit is a recalibration of relations, kind of an increasing kind of assertiveness from Washington. And we've heard about kind of Mexico, but also if you look to the north of the US, Canada as well, and as I mentioned, kind of domestically, and also the knock-on international effects, as you saw at the UN General Assembly, right? Kind of general architecture of international relations increasingly under pressure. Now, I don't have to talk too much about US-Mexico relations because we had very nice kind of presentations that set those out. But in general, just would like to emphasize again, once again, that kind of the largest U.S. trading partner, U.S.'s largest trading partner. Also, Mexico is a major source of immigration. And also, Mexico provides a critical labor source that remains valuable across all sectors in the U.S. And this is still true kind of today in October 2025, and kind of a growing electorate and influence within domestic politics. And in the background, as Ambassador Bernal set out, there's a myriad of issues that, regardless of the state of the relationship between the administrations, require bilateral cooperation, right? From migration, crime, counter-trafficking, public health, trade, all of these, right? And so these set the background, and also kind of you might think about kind of what direction this is traveling in. You might kind of the prospective U.S.-Mexico security agreement on counter cartel operations that was raised the previous month. But of course, adversarial rhetoric has strained cooperation, deep concern about treatment of Mexican origin communities in the U.S. Of course, domestic immigration enforcement in the U.S. impacts upon U.S.'s foreign relations, and attempts to kind of calibrate this. As I mentioned, right, there's a lot of policy flux, right? Attempts to stabilize ties and try to recenter diplomacy to manage interdependence. Let's go. But it's not just Mexico, right? You're seeing this across Latin America. September, just last month, Trump decertifies Colombia as a reliable partner on the US's kind of long-term kind of war on drugs. This is kind of remarkable in a sense. It's the first time in decades. Most argue that it's more symbolic than damaging, but it's sure to potentially kind of affect loans and could be a precursor to kind of aid cuts and kind of further recalibration of U.S.-Colombia relations. And also kind of, as mentioned, kind of adversarial rhetoric. Trump has kind of argued that President Trump has argued that failed accommodation with narco-terrorists has driven cocaine production to historic levels, kind of framing the context of the drug trade. And also kind of from the perspective of the broader State Department, Colombia's leadership is largely blamed for this, though there's a waiver that does keep military and some humanitarian assistance flowing. So kind of challenging relationship there. Of course, we can't not mention Venezuela. Kind of this is long-term going back. Kind of this is not just something that's part of the second Trump administration, but escalation in tensions there with an ending of diplomatic talks with Maduro and kind of Trump instructing Richard Grenell to halt outreach. You've all probably kind of followed kind of U.S. military strikes on alleged drug running vessels near Venezuela, and an increasingly framing of kind of counter narcotics operations through kind of international humanitarian law and kind of laws of armed conflict, right? And so kind of describes it as a non-international armed conflict. The Trump administration describes the U.S. as in a non-international armed conflict with cartels. And also kind of the prospect for additional strikes and what that might mean and the disruption that could kind of cause. And also the Trump administration does deny kind of planning outright regime change, but nonetheless, right, has kind of issued kind of monetary awards leading to Maduro's arrest and links Maduro publicly to trafficking. Interestingly, also is Brazil. As you move further south, I mean, Brazil is a kind of major kind of regional power, major destination for U.S. investment, kind of key state in South America, and rising trade frictions, of course, in the context of Bolsonaro, potential ripple effects across supply chains, and that kind of trade relationship, and the administration's own judicial and political sensitivities are complicating ties. And kind of this kind of perception of U.S. action, kind of attempting to influence domestic politics of Brazil. One thing to kind of circle back to a little bit later on, though, is of course, Brazil, within the context of the BRICS, has put an emphasis on kind of emerging technologies governance, right, as a core platform of foreign policy. Now, so in this kind of presentation here, I'll look at just simply kind of China's expanding impact, kind of influence on U.S. Latin America relations. So not kind of Latin America-China relations specifically, but looking at in the context of, from the perspective of the US, right? So just some visuals. We've seen a lot of this data in the previous presentations. For most of Latin America, kind of as 2023, right? China is now a top trading partner. Kind of the exception would just be the kind of the northern tier of the South American continent. Significant trade volumes. Kind of significant amount of jobs attributed to Chinese investment. And as we heard in the previous presentation, right, from Professor Escalante, kind of growing economic engagements and potential strategic investments across the region. You might think about kind of ports, grids, mining. We haven't really talked about rare earths and strategic competition, but it's kind of an increasing focus there. And security attention to increasing U.S. security attention to ports and critical infrastructure. And so I was curious about Ambassador Burnell's presentation, because and also Professor Escalante, both of them have pointed out, right, that from the perspective of Latin American countries, right, you might have a move from kind of assumptions behind alignment to that of non-alignment, or kind of as has been brought up in a Mexican context, like active non-alignment, right? You're already seeing that, right? So kind of diversification of partnerships as the global order is in flux to gain leverage, right? So countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile have all deepened their China links. In some cases, you kind of have this as kind of accelerated balancing in response to kind of unpredictability and kind of uncertainty as to where policies in Washington are going to settle. But you also have asymmetric dependencies within the region. Some countries in the region are much more dependent on the US, right? So if you think about Mexico and Central America, as was noted in the previous presentations, are much more tied to the US. And so kind of other responses within that context, right? You said Brazil, again, is seeking autonomy, but within the context of BRICS, right? You kind of all sorts of discussions about dollar and alternatives. And also if you think about kind of broader geopolitics and aversion to taking strong stances on global conflicts, right? Like so Brazil has a nuanced stance in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and kind of a balancing of US, China, and the global South. Kind of two key pillars that are kind of important, environmental leadership and South-South ties, but also emerging tech leadership and South-South ties. And this would be interesting to hear more about from a Chinese perspective and Chinese colleagues in the coming days, because China has positioned itself as a kind of global leader when it comes to providing global South countries with access to emerging technologies. If you think about the Chinese resolution in the UN General Assembly on artificial intelligence, like kind of major emphasis on access. And also, if you just look at China's model towards strategy for development in terms of emerging technologies, a lot of the focus is on getting things to market quickly and also cheaply. Whereas the US is invested in this super expensive strategy that's seeking to kind of, that relies on a heavy tech infrastructure and also has a different kind of set of goals, right? So you might think about kind of in the context of Amazon, climate finance, and also green industrial policy. So US policy instruments are in flux, right? I mentioned like it's not clear exactly where the dust settles. There's kind of a lack of policy cohesion in some respects when it comes to a lot of the issues that we have discussed. But right, as I mentioned, kind of this certain kind of values elements are certainly kind of absent from the new administration. And also kind of this questionship, kind of reevaluations of relations. So as you have other countries are looking back towards the US, kind of, so what kind of partner is the US? And a kind of crumbling aid, like the architecture of the liberal order that Professor Escalante had mentioned, right, is increasingly under stress. Of course, from the US perspective, and also from the kind of other country outside perspective, tariffs and unilateral measures are reshaping incentives. So as other countries seek to respond, And also kind of an overemphasis on short-term leverage might bring about long-term costs in these relationships. From the US perspective as well, like there's a very big focus, as you know, kind of on trafficking, kind of fear of expanding into new geographies. Of course, migration and narcotics flows are not something that can be viewed necessarily in isolation, but these are deeply intertwined with governance and broader issues and require, as I mentioned, bilateral cooperation. You see some countries where you have kind of rising penetration by cartels. And again, you think about this in context of cross-border law enforcement, perhaps also kind of from the perspective of public health. And it's complex in the sense that domestic policy responses are needed to respond, needed in response to external vulnerabilities. But of course, this administration has taken on a kind of armed conflict approach thus far to addressing this. You might also think about kind of climate environmental security in the context. And again, these is kind of a backdrop to the US-China relationship, right? So you might think about this as like opportunities for engagement or kind of risks. Of course, globally, increasing climate stresses, droughts, glacier melts, kind of electricity grid instability, major kind of agricultural disruptions as a result of droughts, challenging kind of hydropower infrastructure. You might think about water security. Water security is also important in the context of broader emerging technologies governance, right? If you think about data centers, and sometimes you do hear about countries having trade-offs, right? You could have a data center in a semi-arid part of your country, and then you would have this question of like, well, the farmers aren't getting water because the data center is. And of course, the US is largely kind of absent now from the kind of climate governance. I'm kind of getting a little bit closer to time, but some things to consider in terms of kind of a cooperative relationship, though, is thinking about like, well, as I said, kind of things are in the air, right? Perhaps modernization of migration governance, kind of combination of legal pathways and enforcement. Of course, we have kind of very one-sided approach at the moment. And also kind of trade and supply chain security. This is going to be understood in the US context, though, in the context of US-China strategic competition, as Professor Escalante mentioned in one of her previous slides, about if you look at kind of the general kind of Trump administration strategy, for example, to win the race in artificial intelligence, it's about getting countries to buy into the full US tech stack, meaning that this is something that is seen as a kind of an arena for strategic competition between the US and China. So, because some questions you might want to consider, like within this context, right? Can the US offer kind of credible alternatives, like think about kind of speed, scale, and transparency, in addition to kind of total investment? Also, you might think about kind of targeted investment and also critical minerals. The supply chain is one of the things that's a core focus of not just the US, but other countries would be kind of rare earth minerals. But it's also, again, important if you think about like Bolivia and the lithium trade or lithium trade in the southern core of Africa, and the extent to which kind of these countries can avoid a with us or against us framing, right? Which we saw in the last slide, right? This can cut against kind of emerging non-alignment realities within the region. So kind of think I'm kind of running out of time. So just some things to watch, right? So if you want to know what direction things are going to go, think about kind of, well, what further cuts to US budgets are you going to see? Kind of also look at mandates for democracy and development. Some key things to watch, like, for example, exchanges, like what's the future of the kind of the Fulbright program going on. Also, another thing to watch is escalation of US military force as a counter-narcotics tool. How heavily does this administration lean into this in the future? And also China's engagements and US responses to things like ports, grids, electric vehicles, and other kind of emerging technologies. And so key takeaways from this kind of bird's eye view: we are in an early fluid period, right? So policies are in flux within the new administration. You already get a sense of where the administration is heading. My guess is that these are more long-term changes, right? They reflect US strategic competition with China. And this isn't kind of in a party political context. This is in a context of kind of generally speaking, right? So I'd say that if you would see kind of the Democratic Party return to the White House, you would see some changes, perhaps most visibly when it comes to values and promotion. But when it comes to US-China competition, not so much. And so when it comes to trade, I don't know if there's going to be a kind of going back to the relationships that existed in the past. And also China's influence reshapes the bargaining power of Latin American states across Latin America vis-a-vis the US. You have kind of increasingly kind of plural international relations. And to the extent that US policy towards Latin America is effective in achieving policy goals, this is going to depend on credible cooperation, and policy cohesion, right, is going to have to come to the fore. So I think I went a little bit over 15 minutes, but thank you once again, everybody, for kind of attending, and it was a pleasure to see you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lamon, and sorry to hurry us along. You might add further thoughts in the question and answer session. Well, I think that having mapped the strategic landscape for Mexico-China ties in a new global era, reframe development from a global south perspective, and examined how US policy shapes the regional scenario, we now turn to what I think is the most actionable bridge between strategy and results: climate cooperation. Our final speaker, Dr. Guo Jianping, will discuss climate change and potential cooperation opportunities for Mexico and China. Dr. Guo, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you. Can you see my screen well?
Very well, thank you.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me. And it's a great honor to present my recent study here. And my background is in law. So I've seen my panelists talking about this end of certainty between this relationship between US, China, and Mexico. And my focus would be more on a much more narrower perspective. And I will have a legal perspective focusing on this end of certainty from a climate change perspective. So my 15 minutes, I'll talk about these four things. First of all, I would like to introduce you what are the climate change effects on the marine environment, and also what international law would require states to do to deal with all these climate effects that's causing what our topic today is, which is uncertainty or the end of certainty. And then what does that actually bring us in terms of the legal uncertainties today? And most importantly, coming to what can we do between Mexico and China as cooperation opportunities. So first of all, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the climate effects on environment in general or on marine environment, because my background is in law, and then I focused on environmental law during my master's and PhD on marine environmental law. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing what are the current three major marine effects that we suffer due to climate change. And the first of all is ocean warming. The reason ocean is warming is because the water actually absorbs more than 90% of the heat that is generated by the greenhouse gas emission. And because of that, one of the most noticeable effect to, for example, here in Germany, I'm currently in Germany, is species migration or species stock specifically redistribution. So stocks are, because of the water's warming, they're migrating away from where they used to live and potentially to North Pole, towards the North Pole for colder water. And for that, a lot of coastal countries are losing their very important, economically important fish stocks. For example, the mackerel war happened before that caused these dual parallel litigations. That is still going on today. For example, between the UK and the EU, the most recent case decided a couple months ago that this tiny little fish called sand eel they're migrating because the ocean's warming. They're migrating a little bit more in certain area that caused the dispute between the UK and the EU. So due to all that, warming ocean, there are actually effects for economic reason, for example, fish stocks. And another very important effect on the marine environment is because also caused by ocean warming is due to marine habitat. For example, for coral bleaching, and we can see that because coral reefs is a very important area or for habitat for a lot of marine species, and if they're dying, the marine biodiversity we're going to lose a lot of the diversity as well. And the next important effect is ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is caused by the CO2 dissolved into water that they combined with H2O will form carbonic acid. And this acid is making the pH level in the water more acidy. And this will directly impact organisms. For example, they use calcium to build their shells and skeletons. And most obvious noticeable change we've seen lately is on shellfish. I'm not sure if everybody is big on eating shellfish, but we can notice even by our eyes, buying some shellfish these days, they look dramatically different from before. So that's one of the effects that we can actually experience as a customer on climate change. And also sea level rising, this is most importantly, for example, to small island states. And as you can see in this picture, this is the Minister for Justice from Tuvalu, which is a small Pacific island country, that this place that he was standing at used to be just an area that people live. So sea level rise affect small island states a lot more than big countries like, for example, Mexico, China. So with all those problems that caused by climate change on the marine environment, the questions could arise relating to international law is what can international law assist in helping countries to deal with climate change effects? And most importantly, what are states required to do under international legal obligations? And because here international law are very general and vague, so that lead to two of the most recent cases, advisory opinions, and one is by International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which is here located in Hamburg, and the other is the International Court of Justice Climate Change Advisory Opinion. And these two cases basically demonstrated or illustrated what states are required to do to deal with climate change and what international law can assist in dealing with climate change effects. And this is the ITLO's climate change advisory opinion. And this is a case that's attended by most amount of countries, actually, in the history of the tribunal. And the questions asked here are two questions and pretty much relating to marine environment, asking the tribunal to clarify what are states required to do. And the decisions the tribunal made are in several ways very cutting edge. First of all, the tribunal decided that climate change or greenhouse gas emission is actually a type of marine pollution. And because of that, climate change, because it's a type of marine pollution, that states are required to actually control, reduce that pollution. And under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, there are many obligations, legal obligations, states are required to do. For example, under Article 194, states are required to take all necessary measures to reduce and control this pollution caused by greenhouse gas emission. And this is in international law a due diligence obligation, which means it's an obligation of conduct. What our states do as for conduct, they don't really require states to achieve certain result, which will be an obligation of result. And also, states are required to not cause transboundary pollution caused by greenhouse gas emission. And we know that greenhouse gas emission can go from one country's boundary to another, and now states are specifically required to control that as well. And because transboundary effect is involved, the tribunal said this due diligence obligation is actually more stringent, which means states are required to do more conduct to prevent transboundary effect to other states. And also, most importantly, to cooperate. Our theme today for this webinar is states are under several obligations to actually promote cooperation, which I'll talk about this in details later regarding China and Mexico potential cooperation opportunities. And the next one is International Court of Justice Climate Change Advisory Opinion, and this is also the case that got most of the amount of country participating, and they've got in the history of International Court of Justice and its predecessors, the Permanent Court of International Justice, the highest level amount of participation by countries in one single case. And this actually, because over 96 countries participated, this some commentary saying this is actually making the ICJ really a world court. And these are the questions that asked to the International Court of Justice. They're more broadly than the one we saw earlier, because this is not only focusing on marine environment, most importantly on international law in general. And what the International Court of Justice decided that for states who are parties to the UNFCCC, we all need to adopt measures with a view to contribute to the mitigation of climate effects, and most importantly, with a duty to cooperate with each other and in order to achieve the objective of the convention, which is to reduce and mitigate the effect of climate change. And for states who are parties to the Paris Agreement, we have actually more stringent or higher level of requirement now. The court decided that for states who are parties to the Paris Agreement, we now have to achieve this temperature goal, which the court set as 1.5 degrees C rather than 2.0 degrees C. And for that, states are required to actually set up their national contribution that's capable of achieving this temperature goal of 1.5 Celsius. And most importantly, to implement this national determined contributions, because previously this was more of a procedural requirements, whereas right now countries are actually required to implement them. And also a couple obligations to cooperate with each other, which I think I have a few minutes left. I will talk into details about this obligations to cooperate. And this is not only under international law, for example, like Paris Agreement, UNFCCC, but most importantly, also under customary international law. So that means for states who are not parties to UNCLOS, UNFCCC, Paris Agreement, for example, the United States, they're also under this legal duty to cooperate with others as well. And that duty to cooperate in good faith actually manifest into two ways. One is to cooperate, negotiate at the beginning in good faith, and also to renegotiate in good faith as well, to be able to prepare to modify their original positions. And most importantly, the court decided that if you breach any of the obligations that we just talked about, and it will constitute a international wrongful act. For those of you that your background is not in law, that means that countries right now can be sued for not performing or fulfilling their obligations that we mentioned earlier. And that caused all these legal certainties. The most important one is climate litigation, whereas both Mexico and China are big emitters. Of course, China is the biggest in the world. And under the obligations right now, we all are under the obligations to implement our national determined contribution and to set it up accordingly and to implement it. And most importantly, I see I have not 2 minutes left. So for cooperation opportunity, the last part of my presentation today, for Mexico and China, because of all the obligations the courts and tribunals identified, and we are both major developing countries, and we are all under the obligation to reduce our GHG greenhouse gas emission. So first of all, the obligation to cooperate, we can actually adopt measures together collectively to combat climate change. And although we're on two sides of the Pacific Ocean, I do think we have ways to do that, which I'll go into details soon. And also, this is under another article of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We can promote studies together and undertake scientific research together, which I think these webinars that we're doing, or the series of webinars we're doing, is a form of exchange of information and to do scientific research together. But for my research, I've seen following webinars for this series dealing with more specific legal issues, and that is actually Mexico and China carrying out this obligation to cooperate specifically. And also, most importantly or specifically, for fisheries, we are, both Mexico and China are also members to this two regional fisheries management organization. So for these two RFMOs, they're both tuna RFMOs that we are parties to, and they adopt consensus decision-making mechanism in both of these RFMOs. So that means if China and Mexico together are willing to make a difference through these two tuna RFMOs, we potentially can make a difference through this decision-making mechanism in this two regional fisheries management organization that suffers climate change. And tuna actually suffer climate change a lot. And I think I'm only 1 minute over the limit. Thank you very much, and I'm willing to talk more about this in the later in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Quoth, and thank you to all our speakers. I'm really inspired by your remarks. They've widened our horizon, I think, and I'm convinced our audience feels likewise. We'll now open the floor for question and answers. I'll start with the questions submitted in the chat. To keep us on schedule, 2 minutes per response, please. From Alicia Olivas, 2 questions. The first one for Ambassador José Luis Bernal. Under President Claudia Sheinbaum, how should Mexico recalibrate its relationship with China amid current strains with the United States to advance Mexico's economic development? And could you comment on the recent depreciation of the peso against the dollar? The second question for Dr. Mariana Escalante. Is the United States pressuring Mexico over its relationship with China? If so, in which areas? For example, trade and export, invest, foreign direct investment, or overall economic growth? From Mauricio Bastien for all panelists, considering the current USMCA framework, how is Mexico balancing its commitments with the United States while managing its economic relation with China? And recent Mexico tariff measures reflects coordination with Washington to limit China presence in key sectors such as energy or electromobility. From Ilse Galicia, we have 2 questions. How can Mexico engage economically with both China and the United States in a context of democratic backsliding and limited policymaking capacity? What can be expected after a possible negative review of the USMCA due to Mexico's reform on customs law? From Alonso Coronado, specifically for Dr. Kuo Jianping, given President Trump's recent remarks at the United Nations, disparaging multilateralism and dismissing climate change as a hoax, and concerns that U.S. political system is sliding toward autocracy with future alteration of power increasingly uncertain, would it be fair to suggest that China represents the last viable leader to spearhead a collective global fight against climate change and avert catastrophic outcomes? If not, what realistic configuration of leadership do you see? So thank you very much for your questions. So please, Ambassador, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Jose Joel. I think the question is very, very important to answer, and I would like to mention, I mean, two different implications of this question. One is, what is Mexico doing vis-a-vis the United States in the current transition in international relations, and particularly on the bilateral relations? And the other part has to do with what we are doing or should do in relations with China. In recent months, we know Mexico has implemented notable changes in its public policies in order to avoid or postpone tariffs being threatened or being imposed by the United States. These measures have to do not only with economic matters, but mainly with other sectors, migration, border, drug trafficking, the combat to criminal activities. And this is being done to respond to the new scenario posed by the Trump administration, but also is in preparation for what is expected to be a complicated review of the North American trade agreement. Among these changes, now speaking about economic matters, we have seen several protectionist policies taken by Mexico, in particular related to China, by imposing tariffs on autos, textiles, and hundreds of other products, as it was mentioned in part by Dr. Escalante. The idea with these measures is to reduce the enormous trade deficit we have in this bilateral trade. China has responded with a firm opposition to these measures, also mentioned by. Hence, we should expect further differences in the near future between our two countries, given this taking of action by Mexico in order to respond to additional pressure coming from the United States. Now, we, as researchers, should be able to dedicate additional and further consideration of policies aimed at addressing trade deficits. The answer is not always to increase tariffs in order to reduce the deficit. There are many other measures that can be taken to reduce the deficit, but this is something that goes beyond the short-term consideration. Now, what is the President of Mexico doing? Responding to the new scenarios posed by the United States to the bilateral relations. It has implications for China, but not always the main reason is China. It's mostly how to respond to the United States demands, pressures, coercion, as it was mentioned, and I think this will continue at least until we have a new agreement in the North American region. Now, in the issue of the Mexican peso, I don't have any information that the peso has been devaluing in the last few months. It's rather a very strong currency, and the variations have to do more with the current state of the economy, expectations about growth and the balance of payment, not directly related only to the United States or to the relations with China in terms of economic matters.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mariana Escalante. 2 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think they help us to reaffirm what we were trying to explain in our presentations. And well, to the first question that was directed to me, of course, the US has pressured Mexico in multiple ways. I mean, we have this phenomena, not just recently, not just with Trump, but like it's a historical phenomena, reality. But of course, like recently, we can say that we have seen, I quoted even some declarations from US officials that are explicitly urging Mexico to reduce its dependency on China in certain sectors, like in high tech and microchips, and of course, cars, etc. Like in every aspect of the relationship with China, the US has something to say, even like in the diplomatic aspect, even in the I would even say that even in the cultural aspect, no, I would like to link this reply with the other question that was about how these Mexican tariff measures reflect or not the coordination with Washington. Well, it's the same answer. Since the USMCA was implemented, there was this provision called the non-market country FTA clause, the Article 32.10, and it prohibits any member of the USMCA to establish a free trade agreement with another countries. This is specifically directed to China, no? So this is an example. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen with the USMCA. But yeah, these Mexican tariff measures against China reflect this strategy that is coordinated specifically by the US, by the US concerns like protecting the domestic industry, Chinese versus Chinese imports. And of course, just to conclude, Mexico has a very complicated scenario because on one hand, Mexico has to protect its industries. Mexico has to respect the USMCA to attend the US demands and also to manage its relation with China. So it's a very complicated scenario. And as Christopher mentioned, we're just beginning to see what's going to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Escalante, for your answer. So please, Dr. Lamont, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the questions. Now, of course, I can speak less as to kind of how Mexico could or should kind of respond to these forces that are kind of affecting or impacting upon Mexico's relations with China and the US. But broadly speaking, I'd emphasize that while the US definitely is focused on China more broadly, right, as Professor Escalante mentioned, has something to say almost on every aspect of the Mexico-China relationships, there will be different sectors where there's going to be increased sensitivity. So if you look at, for example, what the administration's priorities are and what it's saying kind of in terms of kind of its kind of global strategy and worldview towards China, one of those is likely going to remain kind of the technology, right, as mentioned, right? So that's kind of semiconductors, this type of competition is going to remain, is going to be sensitive. But that being said, and I think that kind of the last presentation by Professor Guo highlighted cooperation in the context of climate change, growing kind of multilateralism that is looking at different poles in international relations, right? Kind of looking at different institutions. There is scope for kind of cooperation in that regard, but of course, like as was mentioned, like a China-Mexico free trade FTA would be something that would likely that would be hard to imagine, even in the absence, right, of kind of the current kind of arrangement with the U.S. and Mexico. So. That being said, I'd say that for like a kind of discussion like this is to look at kind of those particular issue areas where perhaps there's kind of less sensitivity or kind of Washington is withdrawing from and kind of put an emphasis on those. So those are my initial thoughts. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Jianping Huo. Thank you. 2 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, President Xi delivered a video speech at the United Nations Climate Change Summit. I think it was roughly 2 weeks ago. And he announced China's new round of national determined contribution to climate change. And what we're to achieve are twofold. First of all, we'll try to reach carbon or CO2 peak by 2030, before 2030, and also try to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And also, President Xi said that by 2035, China's economic-wide net GHG emission, greenhouse gas emission, will decrease by 7 to 10% from the peak level. And if you're familiar with this GHG emission numbers, you know these are very high level of greenhouse gas emission decrease that's committed by China. So I'm not. I'm currently in Germany I'm not sure about leading anyway, but one thing I noticed is that before, when I studied here in Europe, I've never seen any Chinese cars here on the street in Europe. But this time, especially here in Germany, as their car industry playing such an important role in their economy, in their society and everything, I'm seeing more of Chinese electricity cars here in Germany. And I feel, at least I feel very proud of trying to, through EVs, we're trying to at least cut down some of the greenhouse gas emission caused by traditional oil or gas in a way. So relating to the question, I'm not sure if we're leading, but we are actually demonstrated the sense of major power in terms of cutting down our greenhouse gas emission and trying to also, in terms of trade or in terms of EVs or anything in specific, we're trying to make a difference at least. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for the answers. We have 3 final questions from Angelica Muñoz. In this area of uncertainty, what could be the role of the business sector and the cultural and diplomatic exchange going forward? From Jose Luis Enciso, he said that limited US-China cooperation on targeted issues would be mutually beneficial, but the relationship is stalled. Mexico sits in the middle, deeply tied to the US via USMCA, while expanding trade and investment with China. So the question is, how can Mexico maintain an independent, balanced foreign policy that advances its national interest without being forced to pick a side? And the last question from Xi Liang: does Mexico's experience demonstrate that the crisis of the liberal international order inevitably forces middle powers into a binary choice? Or can it forge a viable third way, a foreign policy that is autonomous, agile, and capable of managing the competing imperatives of a bipolar world? So whoever would like to respond, please keep it to 1 minute.
If I may, very briefly, addressing the 3 different questions, I think that Mexico shouldn't take sides. Unfortunately, now it must, because of the aggressiveness of United States policy and the strong interdependence existing between Mexico and the United States. Let's remember that we have a relationship of 80% of trade, Mexican trade, depending on the United States. We have a migration sector with more than 40 million people of Mexican origin living in the United States. Investments and value chains are highly related to the 2 countries, and these are in the Mexican economy working mostly in labor-intensive sectors. That means employment, local development, and the incorporation of technologies. We have a shared border. We also have common natural resources, and we have a long-term relationship that we need to keep and to continue cultivating, to say so. What we can do, we need to follow very closely the negotiations the United States will engage in with China. I think this is very important. In the next few weeks, we may see all of a sudden a big agreement between the US and China. And we should try to be part of that negotiating table so that Mexico and Canada are not left behind. We're talking mostly about the USMCA, a regional agreement. When we need to introduce more and more the extra-regional component of these relationships, in plural, North America with other regions, the United States with China, United States with Europe, and also the bilateral relations, Canada, United States, Mexico, United States. So there is a lot to do. That means a new kind of diplomacy. There is no independent way to do it right now. We can imagine ways, but that is not feasible. And we need to dedicate our intellectual work and brains to examine possibilities, real possibilities, to present different scenarios, and to be realistic on what can be achieved in the short term, thinking in the longer term.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anyone who wants to take the floor one more minute? Dr. Lamont, please.
Yeah, just kind of a broad perspective on this, because I think the last question conjured up images, almost Cold War images of like the non-aligned movement, right? Kind of what could a third way kind of emerge? And I think in today's world, that's not what we're likely to see. We're going to be managing very complex interdependencies, right? So I think it'll be very different. It'll be a different kind. And I think that also in the long term, from the US perspective, kind of demanding kind of countries take sides is something that's kind of probably going to make kind of smaller that group of countries that can. But the US and Mexico have a special relationship that's different than a lot of other countries that people talk about. And as the ambassador mentioned, right, there's all very complex interdependency, kind of the myriad of different issues, right, that require bilateral cooperation. So even when relations are hard, relations still have to be managed. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Escalante, Professor Kuo.
Well, I wouldn't add much from what my colleagues said. Of course, we shouldn't be forced to decide to align to which country. But of course, if we had to, we would choose the US without any doubt. I mean, I don't want to be negative or anything, but of course, we have a very heavily integrated relationship with North America, with the US, even if we don't have the USMCA. But of course, talking about other aspects like business, cultural, and diplomatic exchanges, I think in these areas, Mexico can get a very strong relationship with China, no? And well, also the economic sector. But I think it's not that we have to choose, but if we have to, we would choose on the US side, of course.
Thank you very much, Professor Kuo.
I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. If there's one takeaway from today, it's this. Mexico doesn't need to choose a side. It needs to choose a strategy. We map the big picture, heard a global South rethink of development, weighed how US policy shapes the room for maneuver, and ended with climate as the most actionable bridge from ideas to results. Your questions push us further on pressure from Washington, a possible rough USMCA review, and whether a third way is viable for middle powers. The path forward is pragmatic, keep USMCA compliance tight, diversify diversify but smartly with China, where it creates jobs and productivity, turn climate cooperation into cheaper, cleaner energy and traceable supply chains, and bring business, universities, and subnational governments into execution. That's how Mexico protects its autonomy and advances its interests without being forced into a binary choice. Thank you very much to our speakers, to our audience, and our partner institutions for making this first session a success. See you next Wednesday, October 15, 7 p.m. Mexico City time. Thursday, October 16, 9 a.m. Beijing time. Same Zoom link. We have a great day and night. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Xie, saludos desde Cancún. Xie.
Thank you.
Thank
Xie
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. 谢谢。
谢谢，再见。
再见.
Thank you very much, Jose Joel. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, Ernesto. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you.